In the center of New York City, amidst the skyscrapers and the incessant hum of the metropolis, stood the Blackwood Industries Building, an empire built by the hands of William Blackwood. The man, who had just turned 55, was known in the city not only for his wealth, but also for his reputation as a ruthless and selfish man. William was sitting in his top-floor office, looking out at the city through the panoramic windows. His gray eyes, cold as steel, stared into the distance. Suddenly the door opened and his secretary, Linda, entered the room. "Mr. Blackwood," she began nervously, "the representatives of the Hope for Children Charity Foundation have asked to see you again. They—" William interrupted her abruptly. "Linda, how many times do I have to tell you? No charitable organizations, no requests for help. It's a waste of my time." Linda sighed. "But, sir, they say the situation is critical. The orphanage is on the verge of closing, and if—" "I'm not interested," William cut her off coldly. "Let them contact the city authorities. I'm running a business here, not giving money away to anyone." The secretary nodded and left the office, leaving William alone with his thoughts. He went to the window, watching the bustle of the streets below. "They don't understand anything," he thought. "If only they knew the truth." That evening, William drove home in his black Bentley. The driver, Michael, who had been working for him for 15 years, drove the car silently through the streets. "Stop here," William suddenly said, pointing to a small alley. Michael looked in the rearview mirror in surprise, but obeyed the order. William got out of the car, holding a small bag. "Wait for me here," he told the driver and disappeared into the darkness of the alley. 20 minutes later, he returned empty-handed. His face was impassive, but something like relief flashed in his eyes. "Go home," he ordered shortly. Michael nodded, trying to hide his surprise. It wasn't the first time his boss had made such mysterious stops, but he knew better than to ask questions. The next morning, William woke up to a call from his CFO, Robert. "William, we're in trouble," he heard a worried voice on the phone. "Journalists are starting to dig into us. They are asking about the large sums of money that are regularly withdrawn from our accounts." William tensed, but his voice remained calm. "Robert, I've already told you this is my personal business. Send them to hell." "But, William," Robert insisted, "they won't go away. They think we're involved in some kind of illegal dealings. We have to do something." William took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Listen to me carefully. This money is my property. I can do whatever I want with it. If anyone has any questions, they can come to me directly. Now get on with the job and stop panicking." He hung up the phone, feeling the tension building. The years of carefully constructed image of a tough businessman could fall apart in an instant. But he couldn't let that happen. Too many people depended on his secret help. William walked over to the safe, hidden behind the painting in his office. Opening it, he pulled out a folder of documents. It contained the names, addresses, and photographs of people he had helped over the years. Among them was Elizabeth Thompson, a widow with 2 children who was about to lose her home to debt. He recalled the first time he saw her story in the local newspaper. The woman, who had lost her husband in a car accident, was trying to raise 2 young children alone and work 2 jobs to make ends meet. It reminded him of his own childhood, when his mother struggled to feed the family after his father died. William sighed as he closed the folder. He knew that his actions might seem strange or even suspicious to others. But for him, it was the only way to repay the help his own family had once received. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It was his housekeeper, Mrs. Jenkins. "Mr. Blackwood," she said as she entered the room, "there are letters here, and also, there are those journalists again. They're waiting at the gate." William nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. I'll take care of it." When she left, he went to the window. Indeed, there was a group of reporters with cameras and microphones standing at the gate of his estate. They were like jackals, ready to tear any story into sensational headlines. William knew that sooner or later he would have to face them. But not today. Today he had more important things to do. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Michael, get the car ready. We're on our way." Elizabeth Thompson stood at the window of her small house, watching her children, 10-year-old Tom and 8-year-old Emma, play in the yard. Their laughter echoed in the air, but Elizabeth's heart was tight with anxiety. She knew that this house, the only thing left of her late husband, could be lost to debt. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Elizabeth flinched, afraid it might be another debt collector. But when she opened the door, there stood a courier with an envelope in his hands. "Mrs. Thompson?" he asked. "Yes, it's me," Elizabeth replied, trying to hide her anxiety. "This is for you," the courier said, handing her the envelope. "Have a nice day." Elizabeth closed the door and slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a bank statement and an anonymous note. Her eyes widened in shock when she saw the amount on the statement, enough to cover all her debts and then some. With trembling hands, she unfolded the note. "Dear Mrs. Thompson, your family deserves a better future. Use these funds wisely and do not lose hope. Your children are your greatest asset. Sincerely, a friend." Elizabeth sank into a chair, unable to believe her eyes. Who could send her such a large sum of money, and why anonymously? Meanwhile, across town, William Blackwood was sitting in his office, reviewing reports on the latest anonymous donations. He always personally checked to make sure that the money reached its intended recipients. "Mr. Blackwood," Linda's voice came over the intercom. "Miss Anderson from the New York Times is here. She insists on meeting with you." William sighed. Katie Anderson was a well-known journalist who specialized in investigations related to big business. He knew that sooner or later she would take an interest in his business. "All right, Linda, send her in," he said, preparing for an unpleasant conversation. Katie Anderson entered the office, her penetrating eyes immediately taking in every detail. "Mr. Blackwood, thank you for taking the time to see me," she began. "Miss Anderson, I am a very busy person. How can I help you?" William asked coldly. Katie pulled out a notepad. "I'm investigating some strange financial transactions involving your company. Large sums of money are regularly disappearing from your accounts, but there's no trace of where they're going. Would you like to comment on this?" William remained calm. "Miss Anderson, my personal finances are my own business. I'm not obliged to report to the press about my every move." "But, Mr. Blackwood," Kathy insisted, "these sums are too large to ignore. People have a right to know if you're involved in any illegal dealings." William felt his anger begin to boil inside, but he remained cold on the outside. "Miss Anderson, I understand that you are looking for a sensation, but I assure you that all my actions are absolutely legal. If you have specific accusations, please contact my lawyers. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an important meeting." Katie reluctantly stood up. "This is not over, Mr. Blackwood. I'm going to get to the bottom of this." After she left, William took a deep breath. He knew that Katie Anderson would not give up so easily, but he couldn't let her reveal his secret. Too many people depended on his help. That evening, William decided to check on the Thompson family for himself. He parked his inconspicuous car not far from their home and watched. He saw Elizabeth playing with the children in the yard, their faces shining with happiness. This was what he was doing all this for. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to another car parked a little further away. Katie Anderson was sitting in it, taking notes in a notebook. William tensed. Was she already on the trail? The next day, William called his old friend and lawyer, Richard Oakes. "Richard, I need your advice," William said when they were alone in his office. "What's wrong, Will?" Richard asked, sensing his friend's concern. William told him about the Katie Anderson investigation and his concerns. Richard listened intently and then said, "Will, what you're doing is noble, but you have to understand the risks. If the truth comes out, it could destroy everything you've built." "I know," William replied, But I can't stop. These people need help. Richard sighed. Okay, here's what we can do. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Thompson was sitting in her bank's office, still in disbelief at what was happening. Well, Mrs. Thompson, the bank manager said, all your debts have been paid off, and you still have a substantial amount left in your account. You can rest easy about your house. Elizabeth felt tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know how it happened. It's like a miracle. The manager smiled. Sometimes miracles do happen, Mrs. Thompson. Someone clearly cares about you. On the way home, Elizabeth couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious benefactor. Who could it be? And why did he decide to help her? In the evening, when the children were already asleep, Elizabeth sat in the kitchen looking through old photos. One of them was of her late husband, John, smiling and happy. She remembered how he always said that good things come back to you. "Oh, John," she whispered, "if only you could see this. Someone saved our family." Suddenly, her gaze landed on an old newspaper clipping she had been saving. It was an article about William Blackwood, a businessman known for his toughness. Elizabeth remembered how John had once worked at one of Blackwood's businesses and always said that there was something more behind the cold facade. Could it really be him? Elizabeth thought, but immediately dismissed the idea. It would be too unbelievable. Meanwhile, William Blackwood was sitting in his office, reviewing the new requests for help. Each story touched his heart, reminding him of his own past. He knew he could not help everyone, but he tried to do his best. Suddenly, his gaze rested on a photograph on the table. It showed a young William with his mother, both smiling despite the difficulties they were facing at the time. "I hope you're proud of me, Mom," he whispered. William knew his path would not be easy. Journalists like Katie Anderson would not stop their investigations. But he was ready to protect his secret at all costs. Because for him, it wasn't just about money or help. It was about hope. The hope that had once been given to him and which he was now trying to pass on to others. Katie Anderson sat at her desk in the New York Times newsroom, surrounded by piles of papers and empty coffee cups. She had been working on an investigation into William Blackwood's financial dealings for several weeks now, and something about the case was bothering her. "Hey, Kathy, you haven't gone home yet?" asked her co-worker Mike as he passed her desk. Katie looked up from her paperwork. "No, Mike. Something doesn't add up here, and I need to figure out what it is." Mike stopped and looked at the scattered papers. "Is this still about that millionaire?" "Yes," Kathy nodded. "Look, here are his company's financial statements for the last 5 years. Every month, large sums of money just disappear." Mike whistled. "Maybe he just likes the high life. Yachts, private jets, all that?" Katie shook her head. "No, this is different. There's no trace of luxury spending. That money just evaporates. And the strange thing is, I can't find any explanation for these transactions." "Do you think it could be related to something illegal?" Mike asked, suddenly interested. "I don't know," Katie admitted. "But it's very suspicious. Blackwood is known for his toughness in business and his desire to maximize profits. Why would he just throw money away like that?" Mike shrugged. "Maybe he's hiding it? Is he evading taxes?" Kathy thought about it. "Maybe. Or worse. Corruption, money laundering. Who knows?" The next day, Katie decided to visit the Blackwood Industries office under the pretext of an interview about the company's success. She hoped that she could observe Blackwood up close and perhaps spot something suspicious. When she entered the huge glass skyscraper, she was met by Linda, Blackwood's secretary. "Miss Anderson? Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you in his office." Kathy went up to the top floor and entered a spacious office with panoramic windows. William Blackwood stood by the window, his back to her. "Miss Anderson," he said without turning around, "I hear you're interested in our finances." Katie tensed. "Mr. Blackwood, I just want to write an article about your company's success. Blackwood turned and gave her a piercing look. Really? I heard you were digging deeper, much deeper. Katie felt her heart beat faster. She hadn't expected him to be so direct. I'm just doing my job, Mr. Blackwood, she replied, trying to remain calm. Blackwood came closer. And what kind of story are you hoping to find, Miss Anderson? Corruption? Financial fraud? Katie decided to go all in. Is there anything to find, Mr. Blackwood? He smiled, but his eyes remained cold. You are playing with fire, Miss Anderson. I advise you to be more careful. After this meeting, Kathy was even more convinced that Blackwood was hiding something. She decided to dig deeper. Kathy spent the next few weeks scrutinizing every detail of Blackwood Industries' financial statements. She contacted former employees of the company, trying to find someone who could shed light on the mysterious transactions. One evening, she received a call from an anonymous informant. Miss Anderson, I hear you're interested in the Blackwood affairs. Who is this? Katie asked tensely. That's not important. What matters is that I know where the money is going. Katie felt the adrenaline pulsing through her veins. Not on the phone, the voice replied. Meet me tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the evening in Central Park, by the fountain. The next evening, Katie waited nervously at the fountain. Suddenly, a hooded man approached her. Miss Anderson? It's me, she replied. What do you know about Blackwood? The man looked around. Blackwood is not who he says he is. This money, it goes to covert operations. What operations? Katie insisted. I can't say more than that, but dig deeper. Look for connections to politicians, to big corporations. Blackwood is building an empire and not always by legal means. With that, the man quickly left, leaving Katie with even more questions. Back in the newsroom, Katie began to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. She created a large diagram on the wall, connecting different transactions, names, and companies. What are you doing here? Mike asked, entering the room late at night. Katie turned to him with a twinkle in her eye. Mike, I think I'm on the trail of something big. Blackwood is not just a tax evader. He's building an entire network of influence. Politicians, judges, big corporations, they're all connected. Mike looked at the chart on the wall. Katie, these are serious allegations. Not yet, she replied. But I'm close, and I won't stop until I know the truth. What Kathy didn't know was that, at that very moment in his office, William Blackwood received a message from his informant. She's digging deeper. She knows about the connections. What do we do? Blackwood looked at the message for a long time before replying, Watch her, but do not interfere. Not yet. He looked out the window at the city at night. His secret was in jeopardy, and he knew he would soon have to make a difficult decision. But for now, the game was on, and William Blackwood wasn't going to go down without a fight. Elizabeth Thompson stood at the window of her small house watching her children, Tom and Emma, play in the yard. She still couldn't believe what had happened over the past few weeks. An anonymous donation had not only saved their home from being sold for debt, but also given them a chance at a new life. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to a black car that slowly drove past their house. Elizabeth tensed up. It was the third time in a week that she had seen the car. Mom, Emma called, running into the house. Look what I found in the mailbox. Elizabeth turned and saw her daughter holding a large envelope. What is it, dear? She asked, taking the envelope. Opening it, Elizabeth found a document and a note inside. Her eyes widened in surprise as she read the contents. Dear Mrs. Thompson, we are pleased to announce that your children, Tom and Emma, have been awarded a full scholarship to attend the prestigious Oakwood Academy Private School. All expenses, including textbooks, uniforms, and transportation, will be covered. Please contact us for further details. Sincerely, Oakwood Academy Administration. Elizabeth felt her breath catch in her throat. This was one of the best schools in town, one she had never dreamed of for her children. What is it, Mom? Tom asked as he approached her. Elizabeth tried to hide her excitement. Nothing, dear. Just some papers. That evening, after the children were asleep, Elizabeth sat in the kitchen rereading the papers. Something about it all seemed strange to her. First, the anonymous donation that saved their home, and now this unexpected scholarship. It was too good to be true. The next day, Elizabeth decided to visit the school in person. When she arrived at Oakwood Academy, she was greeted by a friendly receptionist. "How can I help you?" she asked with a smile. Elizabeth showed her the letter. "I received this yesterday. I would like to know more about this scholarship." The secretary looked over the documents and suddenly raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Oh, it's a special scholarship from our anonymous benefactor. We have received instructions to provide your children with everything they need." Elizabeth felt dizzy. An anonymous benefactor? But who is this? And why us? The secretary shrugged her shoulders. "I'm afraid I don't have that information. We are just following instructions." On the way home, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it all. She remembered the black car she often saw near her house. Could it be connected? In the evening, when the children were already asleep, Elizabeth heard a knock at the door. She opened it and saw a middle-aged woman with a notebook in her hand. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Katie Anderson from the New York Times. May I speak with you for a moment?" Elizabeth tensed. "What about?" Katie smiled. "I'm writing a story about people who have received unexpected financial aid. I heard that you recently experienced something similar." Elizabeth felt her heart start to beat faster. I don't know what you're talking about." "Mrs. Thompson," Kathy said gently, "I know about the anonymous donation that saved your house, and about the scholarship for your children." Elizabeth felt panic grip her. How did you know about this?" Kathy took a step forward. "I have my sources, but I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to understand what's going on. Do you know who's behind this aid?" Elizabeth shook her head. "No, I don't know. It was all anonymous." Kathy pulled out a photo. "Have you ever seen this man around your house?" Elizabeth looked at the photo and felt her heart stop. It was William Blackwood, the famous businessman she had only seen on the news. "No," she said, trying to hide her excitement. "I don't know him." Kathy looked at her carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, if you know something, please tell me. It might be important." Elizabeth felt tears coming to her eyes. "I just want to protect my children. I don't know what's going on, but this help, it's changed our lives." Kathy gently put her hand on her shoulder. "I understand, but sometimes help can come from unexpected sources, and not always with good intentions." After Kathy left, Elizabeth couldn't sleep all night. She thought about everything that had happened in recent weeks, about the anonymous donation, about the scholarship, about the black car, and about William Blackwood. The next morning she made a decision. She could not accept this help without knowing where it was coming from and what was expected of her in return. Elizabeth called the school. "Hello, this is Elizabeth Thompson. I'm calling about a scholarship for my children. I appreciate the offer, but we have to decline." She then went to the bank and asked to see the manager. "Mrs. Thompson, how can I help you?" he asked. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I want to return the money that was anonymously transferred to my account, every penny of it." The manager looked at her in surprise. "But why? That money saved your house." "I know," Elizabeth replied, "but I can't accept it. Not like this." When she returned home, she saw the black car parked nearby again. This time, Elizabeth decided to act. She walked up to the car and knocked on the window. The window slowly rolled down and she saw the driver's face. "Who are you?" Elizabeth asked. "And why are you following us?" The driver looked confused. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am." "Whose job?" Elizabeth insisted. "Who hired you?" The driver looked at her silently, clearly not knowing what to say. Suddenly, Elizabeth heard a voice behind her. Mrs. Thompson? She turned around and saw William Blackwood standing a few meters away. Mr. Blackwood? She whispered, feeling her heart beat faster. He took a step forward. I think we need to talk. Elizabeth felt anger and frustration wash over her. Yes, we do need to talk. About why you decided to interfere in our lives. About why you think you can just buy us with your money. Blackwood looked surprised. Mrs. Thompson, I only wanted to help. Help? Elizabeth interrupted him. You think that spying on us is helping? That manipulating our lives is help? She felt tears welling up in her eyes. We are not puppets in your game, Mr. Blackwood. We are human beings, and we deserve respect. Blackwood looked stunned. I never wanted to. But you did, Elizabeth said firmly. And now I want you to leave us alone. I returned the money, and I gave up the scholarship. We will manage on our own. With that, she turned and walked to her house, leaving Blackwood standing in the street, surprised. Once inside, Elizabeth leaned against the door and took a deep breath. She knew she had made a difficult decision, but she also knew it was the right decision. She could not let someone control their life, even if it was done with good intentions. That night, as she lay in bed, Elizabeth thought about the future. She knew it would be hard for them, but she also knew they would make it, together, as a family. Across town, William Blackwood sat in his office looking at a photograph of Elizabeth and her children. He never thought that his attempt to help could have such consequences, and now he didn't know what to do next. Katie Anderson sat at her desk, surrounded by mountains of papers and documents. Her investigation into William Blackwood was gaining momentum, and she felt she was on the verge of a major discovery. Suddenly her phone rang. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. Katie Anderson here, she answered. Miss Anderson, said a quiet voice on the other end of the line. I have some information about William Blackwood that will interest you. Katie tensed. Who is this? That's not important. What's important is that I know about the secret transfers of funds from Blackwood's accounts to ordinary people's accounts. Katie felt her heart beat faster. Go ahead. Meet me in an hour at the Blue Moon Coffee House on the corner of Fifth Avenue. I'll be wearing a blue hat. The call went dead. Katie took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. This could be the breakthrough she had been waiting for. Exactly an hour later, Katie was sitting in a coffee shop looking around nervously. Suddenly, a man in a blue hat approached her table. Miss Anderson? He asked quietly. Katie nodded, and the man sat down across from her. I have proof, he said, pulling out a flash drive. It's got all the details of Blackwood's money transfers to different families around town. Katie took the flash drive with trembling hands. Why are you giving me this? The man smiled grimly. Let's just say I used to work for Blackwood, and I know he's not who he says he is. After the meeting, Katie hurried back to the newsroom. She spent the whole night analyzing the data from the flash drive. With each passing minute, the picture became clearer and more shocking. The next morning, she burst into the editor-in-chief's office. John, I have a bomb, she said, throwing a folder of documents on the desk. William Blackwood is secretly transferring millions of dollars to ordinary people all over the city. John looked at her in surprise. What? Why would he do that? Katie shook her head. I don't know yet, but it's a huge story. We have to publish it. John looked at the documents carefully. Kathy, these are serious allegations. We need more evidence before we can publish this. But we have all this data, Kathy insisted. John sighed. Look, I know how much you want to get this story out, but we can't risk a lawsuit from Blackwood. We need more than that. Talk to the people who received the money. Katie nodded, realizing that John was right. She decided to start with Elizabeth Thompson. When Katie arrived at the Thompsons' house, she saw Elizabeth coming out of the house. Mrs. Thompson, Katie called out. May I speak to you for a moment? Elizabeth tensed when she saw the journalist. Miss Anderson, I've already told you everything I know. Kathy came closer. I know about the money you received from William Blackwood and about the scholarship for your children. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. I don't know what you're talking about. Katie pulled out copies of the documents. I have proof, Mrs. Thompson. I know that you returned the money and gave up the scholarship. But why? What happened? Elizabeth felt tears coming to her eyes. You don't understand. This help. It seemed like a blessing. But then what? Kathy asked gently. Elizabeth took a deep breath. I felt that it was all for a reason, that someone was trying to control our lives, and I couldn't accept that. Kathy nodded, writing down every word. You're not the only one who has received this kind of help. There are other families. Elizabeth looked at her in surprise. Others? How many? Dozens, maybe hundreds, Kathy answered. And all the money comes from William Blackwood. Elizabeth felt her head spinning. But why? Why is he doing this? Kathy shook her head. That's what I'm trying to figure out, and I need your help, Mrs. Thompson. Elizabeth looked at the journalist for a long time before making a decision. Okay, I'll tell you everything I know. Katie spent the next few days talking to other families who had received help from Blackwood. The stories were similar. Unexpected financial help that seemed like a miracle, followed by a sense that there was something more behind it. When Katie returned to the newsroom, she was ready to write her article. But before she could get to the computer, John approached her with a serious expression on his face. Katie, in my office, right away. A man in an expensive suit was sitting in John's office. Katie, this is Mr. Harrison, William Blackwood's lawyer, John introduced him. Mr. Harrison smiled coldly. Miss Anderson, I hear you're preparing an article about my client. Katie tensed. That's true. I'm here to warn you, Harrison continued. If you publish this article, we will sue you for defamation. Kathy felt anger rise in her. I have proof. This is not slander. Harrison smiled even colder. Proof of what, Miss Anderson? That my client helps people? That's not a crime. But why in secret? Katie asked. Why not publicly? Harrison shrugged. Maybe my client is just being modest. In any case, it's none of your business. When the lawyer left, John turned to Kathy. What are you thinking of doing? Kathy took a deep breath. I'm publishing the article. People have a right to know the truth. John nodded. Good. But be prepared for the consequences. The next day, Kathy's article appeared on the front page of the New York Times under the headline, A Billionaire's Secret Charity, Good Intentions or Hidden Control. The reaction was immediate and violent. The phones in the newsroom kept ringing off the hook. People wanted to know more, shared their stories, expressed support or indignation. Elizabeth Thompson was sitting in the kitchen reading an article when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it and saw a crowd of reporters. Mrs. Thompson, what do you think of William Blackwood's actions? Do you feel that you have been used? Why did you return the money? Elizabeth felt panic grip her. She quickly closed the door and leaned against it, shaking. At this time, William Blackwood was sitting in his office looking at the article. His face was impenetrable, but his eyes showed a mixture of anger and sadness. Sir, his secretary said as she entered the office, there are hundreds of calls from journalists. What do I tell them? Blackwood was silent for a long time before answering. Tell them I will make a statement. Tomorrow at 10 in the morning. When the secretary left, Blackwood went to the window and looked out at the city below. He knew that his secret was out, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But would people understand his motives? Would they believe that he really wanted to help? He sighed and returned to his desk. In front of him was a photo of his mother, who had once also received unexpected help in her time of need. I hope you'd understand, Mom, he whispered, before beginning to prepare his press statement. Elizabeth Thompson sat on the couch with her arms around her head. The TV in the corner of the room was broadcasting William Blackwood's press conference, but she could barely hear what he was saying. The last few days had been a nightmare. After Katie Anderson's article was published, Elizabeth's life changed dramatically. Reporters were constantly on duty outside her house. Her neighbors looked at her with suspicion, and children at school started teasing Tom and Emma. "Mom," Emma said quietly, coming up to her, "why is everyone looking at us like that?" Elizabeth looked up, trying to hold back her tears. "People just don't understand, honey. Everything will be fine." But she no longer believed her own words. Yesterday, she received a letter from her employer asking her to take an indefinite leave of absence due to excessive press attention. In effect, she was fired. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Elizabeth tensed, fearing it was reporters again. But when she opened the door, she saw Katie Anderson. "Mrs. Thompson," Katie began, but Elizabeth interrupted her. "What are you doing here? Haven't you ruined our lives enough already?" Katie looked stunned. "I came to apologize. I didn't think things would turn out like this." Elizabeth felt anger rising in her. "You didn't? What were you thinking about when you published that article? Your career? About the sensation?" Katie tried to say something, but Elizabeth continued. "Do you know that I was fired? That my kids are afraid to go to school? That our neighbors look at us like we're criminals?" Kathy began, but Elizabeth interrupted her again. "You didn't? What did you expect? That people would just read your article and forget about it? You've exposed us to the world." Katie looked really upset. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand your anger, but I was just doing my job. People had a right to know the truth." Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "The truth? Are you sure you know the whole truth? Do you know how hard it was to make the decision to return that money? How scary it was to turn down help when you were barely making ends meet?" Kathy listened in silence, not knowing what to say. Elizabeth continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "Do you know what it means to be a widow with 2 children? To wake up every morning and not know if you will be able to feed your children today? And then to get help that seems like a miracle but feel like it's not right?" She paused, trying to hold back her tears. "I returned that money not because I was stupid or proud. It was because I wanted to protect my family. I didn't want anyone to control our lives. But now, I don't know if I can protect my children at all." Kathy stood there, stunned by the force of Elizabeth's emotions. "I didn't know. Katie, I'm really sorry." Elizabeth shook her head. "Your apology won't change anything. Please go away. And don't come here again." When Kathy left, Elizabeth slowly closed the door and leaned against it, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't know what to do next. How to protect her family from this storm that she neither asked for nor deserved. She went back to the living room where Tom and Emma were sitting hugging each other. They looked so small and vulnerable. "Mom," Tom said quietly, "can we get away from here? Somewhere where no one knows us?" Elizabeth felt her heart break at these words. She went to the children and hugged them tightly. "We will make it, darlings. We are strong. We are together. And we will get through this." But deep down, she was not sure of her words. She didn't know how they would handle this situation. But she knew one thing. She would do everything she could to protect her children, even if it meant starting from scratch. William Blackwood stood in front of the mirror in his spacious penthouse, adjusting his tie. In a few hours, he was to give a press conference that could change everything. His eyes fell on a photograph on his dresser, a young woman with a baby in her arms smiling at the camera. "Mom," he whispered, "I hope you would understand. William was born into a poor family on the outskirts of New York City. His father died when he was only 5 years old, leaving his mother alone with a small child and a lot of debt. They lived from paycheck to paycheck, often skipping lunches and dinners. One day, when the situation seemed hopeless, they received an anonymous envelope with money, enough to cover all their debts and even leave some. It changed their lives. William's mother always told him, "Someday, when you grow up and become successful, don't forget to help someone else the way you helped us." These words are deeply rooted in William's soul. When he became a successful businessman, building Blackwood Industries from the ground up, he decided to fulfill his mother's promise. William sighed as he stepped away from the mirror. He remembered how he had started his secret mission to help. At first, it was small amounts of money that he anonymously donated to families in need. Then, as his business grew, the amounts increased. He created a sophisticated system to identify those who really needed help. His assistants collected information about families in difficulty, and William personally decided who to help and how. Elizabeth Thompson was one of those families. When William learned about her story, a widow with 2 children on the verge of eviction, he couldn't help but intervene. But he never expected his help to have such consequences. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was Robert, his CFO. "William," he began excitedly, "are you sure about the press conference? Maybe it's better to deny everything?" William shook his head. "No, Robert, no more lies. It's time to tell the truth." When he arrived at the Blackwood Industries office, a crowd of journalists had already gathered outside. William took a deep breath, bracing himself for the storm that was about to break. The conference room was packed to the brim. Cameras were clicking. Microphones were pointed at the podium. William slowly approached the podium, feeling the hundreds of eyes on him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have gathered you here today to tell you the truth. The truth about me, about Blackwood Industries, and about those mysterious transfers of funds you've all heard about." He paused, looking around the room. "Yes, it's true. I did secretly transfer money to various families around the city, but not for the purpose of control or manipulation, as some people assume, but out of a desire to help." The room became loud. Journalists started shouting questions, but William raised his hand, asking for silence. "I was born into a poor family," he continued. "My mother raised me on her own, often denying herself the basics so that I could have everything I needed. Once, when we were on the verge of eviction, we received anonymous help. This help changed our lives." William took out a photo of his mother and showed it to journalists. "My mother always told me, 'Someday, when you become successful, don't forget to help someone the way you helped us.' And I promised her that I would do that." He took a deep breath before continuing. "When Blackwood Industries became successful, I decided to fulfill my promise. But I wanted to do it anonymously, without publicity. I believe that true charity does not need recognition." Journalists were eagerly recording his every word. William saw among them Katie Anderson, who looked at him with a mixture of surprise and distrust. "I realize that my actions may have seemed suspicious," William continued, "and I'm sorry if they have caused anyone pain or inconvenience. That was never my intention." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I also realize that I may have crossed a line. I may have tried to control something that I could not control, and for that, I sincerely apologize." William looked directly into the cameras. "I especially want to apologize to Elizabeth Thompson and her family. I never meant to cause you any problems. I only wanted to help." The room fell silent. The journalists seemed stunned by this frank confession. "Starting today," William continued, "all of Blackwood Industries' charitable activities will be completely transparent. We will create an official fund to help families in need, and I personally guarantee that every cent will be used for its intended purpose." He took a deep breath. "I'm ready to answer your questions." The room erupted in noise. The journalists shouted questions. "Mr. Blackwood, why did you decide to reveal the truth now? How much money did you spend on this secret charity? Aren't you afraid of criminal prosecution for your actions?" William calmly answered each question without evading or hiding anything. He realized that this could cost him his reputation, perhaps even his freedom. but he felt strangely relieved that he could finally tell the truth. After the press conference, William returned to his office. He felt exhausted, but strangely at peace. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," he said. Kathy Anderson entered the office. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, "I don't know what to say." William smiled weakly. "It's the first time I've ever seen a journalist without words." Katie hesitated. I didn't expect this, all of this." William nodded. "I understand. You were doing your job, Miss Anderson, and you did it well." Katie looked at him. "But at the cost of what? Do you know what is happening to Elizabeth Thompson and the other families?" William sighed. "I do, and this is what haunts me. I wanted to help, and instead—" He didn't finish his sentence, but Kathy understood. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. William looked out the window at the city below. "I'm going to try to fix what I've done, if that's even possible." After Katie left, William stood by the window for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. He knew he had a long and difficult road ahead of him, but for the first time in many years, he felt that he was on the right path. He looked at the photo of his mother and said quietly, "I hope you are proud of me, Mom. I'm trying to do what you taught me." With those words, William Blackwood returned to his desk, ready to face the consequences of his actions and start over, this time openly and honestly. William Blackwood stood at the panoramic window of his office, watching the bustle of the streets of New York. A week had passed since his loud confession at a press conference, and the world around him had changed. The phone on his desk rang again. William didn't even turn to answer it. He knew it was probably another journalist wanting an exclusive interview, or worse, another business partner wanting to sever all ties with Blackwood Industries. "Sir," his secretary's voice came over the intercom, "the board of directors is requesting a meeting. They say it's urgent." William took a deep breath. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes." He went back to his desk and picked up the photo of his mother that always stood there. "What would you say now, Mom?" he whispered. "Would you be proud of me or disappointed?" With these thoughts, he set off for a meeting that he knew could cost him everything he had built up over the years. When William walked into the conference room, all conversation instantly stopped. He felt the cold stares of the board members. "Gentlemen," he began, taking his seat at the head of the table, "I understand that you want to discuss recent events." Robert Sterling, the oldest member of the board, stood up. "William, we have always respected you as a leader and businessman, but what has happened? This is unacceptable." William nodded. "I understand your outrage, but I acted in accordance with my convictions." "Your convictions," another board member interjected, "cost us millions of dollars." The company's stock fell by 30% in a week. Investors were pulling out in droves. William felt his heart sink. He knew the consequences would be severe, but he hadn't expected them to be on this scale. "What do you propose?" he asked quietly. Robert took the floor again. "We think you should temporarily step down from running the company, at least until all of this calms down." William felt anger rising in him. "You want me to leave the company I built?" "You don't understand, William," Robert said gently. "It's not about your intentions. It's about trust. Investors, partners, clients, they've all lost trust in us, and we have to do something about it." William remained silent for a long time, looking at each board member. Finally, he stood up. "I understand your position, but I can't just give up everything I've built. Give me a week. I will try to fix everything." The board members looked at each other, but eventually agreed. As he left the conference room, William felt tired. He returned to his office and fell into his chair, covering his face with his hands. Suddenly, his eyes fell on an old album that was lying on the bottom shelf of his bookcase. William walked over and picked it up, blowing off the dust. Opening the album, he saw photos of his childhood. Here he was, a little boy, standing outside an old house on the outskirts of the city. And here is his mother, tired but smiling, holding his hand. William remembers those difficult times, how often they went to bed hungry, how his mother worked 3 jobs to provide him with everything he needed. He turned the page and saw a photo that changed everything. It showed his mother holding an envelope of money, the same anonymous gift that had saved them from eviction. William remembered how his mother cried then, unable to believe her happiness, and how she told him, "You see, Willie, there are still good people in the world, and one day you will be one of them." These words were deeply rooted in his soul. They have become the driving force behind everything he has done in recent years. William closed the album and went to the window. He looked out at the city below, at the people hurrying about, unaware of the drama that was unfolding high above them. He remembered all the people he had helped over the years, families who were able to keep their homes, the children who got an education, sick people who were able to pay for their treatment. And suddenly, William realized that he had no regrets about any of his actions. Yes, he may have acted wrongly by hiding his charity, but his intentions had always been pure. He turned to his desk and pressed the intercom button. "Linda, get me Katie Anderson at the New York Times. Tell her I'm willing to do a full interview. No restrictions." "But sir," the secretary's excited voice came through, "the board of directors." "I know what they'll say," William interrupted her, "but this is my decision." An hour later, Katie Anderson was sitting across from him in his office, ready for an interview. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, "do you realize that this interview could completely destroy your reputation?" William nodded. "I do. But I also realize that the truth is the only way forward." And he began to talk about his difficult childhood, about his mother, who sacrificed everything for him, about the anonymous gift that changed their lives, and about the promise he made to himself to help others the way he had helped them. He told about every family he helped, about every fate he tried to change for the better, and how painful it was for him to see that his help sometimes did more harm than good. "I know I was wrong to hide my actions," he said in the end, "but I will never regret trying to help people." When the interview was over, Kathy looked at William for a long time, not knowing what to say. "Do you realize that this could be the end of Blackwood Industries?" she finally asked. William smiled weakly. "Perhaps. But if that's the price for staying true to myself and my mother's memory, I'm willing to pay it." When Katie left, William went back to the window. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Perhaps he would lose his company. Maybe his reputation would be ruined forever. But for the first time in a long time, he felt calm. He knew he had made the right choice, and wherever his mother was now, he was sure she would be proud of him. The sun was barely breaking through the heavy clouds when William Blackwood walked out of the Blackwood Industries building. He could feel the eyes of his employees on him, a mixture of surprise, disappointment, and perhaps even pity. His interview with Katie Anderson had appeared in the New York Times that morning, and now the whole world knew his story. William got into his car, but instead of driving home, he asked the driver to take him to the neighborhood where he grew up. As they drove, he looked out the window, remembering his past. They stopped at an old, shabby house. William got out of the car and stood for a long time looking at the place where he had spent his childhood. The neighboring house, where the Thompson family once lived, looked exactly the same as it did 30 years ago. "Mr. Blackwood," a voice said behind him. William turned around and saw an elderly woman looking at him in surprise. "Mrs. Johnson." He recognized his former neighbor. "Do you still live here?" The woman nodded. "Yes, all this time. And are you the same little Willie who always helped me with the garden?" William smiled. "Yes, that's me." Mrs. Johnson came closer. "I've seen you on TV, and I read the newspapers. Are you the man who helped people?" William nodded. Yes, that's true. Suddenly, Mrs. Johnson hugged him. Oh, Willie, your mother would be so proud of you. These words touched William deeply. He felt tears coming to his eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Johnson, he said quietly. It means a lot to me. They talked for a few more minutes, reminiscing about old times. When William returned to the car, he felt that something had changed. Maybe all was not lost. When he returned to the office, William saw Robert, the chairman of the board, waiting for him. William, he began sternly, do you realize what you've done? This interview, it could cost us everything. William looked at him calmly. Robert, I understand your concern, but I couldn't live with this secret any longer. Robert sighed. Investors are panicking. The stocks keep falling. We need to do something, and fast. William nodded. I have an idea. Call an emergency board meeting in an hour. When all the board members were gathered, William stood up and began to speak. Gentlemen, I realize that my actions have damaged our company, but I believe we can turn this crisis into an opportunity. He laid out a plan for them. I propose to create a new division of Blackwood Industries, a charitable foundation that will officially and transparently help those in need. We can use my story as the basis for a new marketing campaign to show the world that Blackwood Industries is not just a soulless corporation, but a company with a heart and a conscience. The board members listened with disbelief, but also with interest. It's risky, said one of them. Yes, William agreed. But sometimes the greatest risks bring the greatest rewards. After much debate, the board agreed to give the plan a chance. William was relieved, but he knew it was only the beginning of a long journey. The next day, he met with Kathy Anderson again. Mr. Blackwood, she said, I was surprised when you asked for another interview. William nodded. Yes, I have something else I want to tell the world about. He told her about Blackwood Industries' new plan, the creation of a charitable foundation, and his intention to make all of the company's charitable activities fully transparent. But most importantly, he said, I want to apologize to all those who have been harmed by my secret help, especially to Elizabeth Thompson and her family. Katie listened intently, taking notes. Do you realize that this could cause a new wave of criticism? People might think you're just trying to save your reputation. William nodded. I understand, but I don't want to hide anything anymore. I want people to know the truth, the whole truth. After the interview, William decided to do something he should have done long ago. He went to Elizabeth Thompson's house. When she opened the door and saw him, her eyes widened in surprise. Mr. Blackwood, what are you doing here? William took a deep breath. Mrs. Thompson, I've come to apologize to you personally for everything that has happened. Elizabeth looked at him for a long time before saying, Come in. They sat down at the kitchen table and William began to tell her his story, about his childhood, about the anonymous help his family had received, about the promise he had made to himself. I never wanted to hurt you, he said. I just wanted to help you, like you helped me once. Elizabeth listened in silence, her face impenetrable. I realize that my actions have caused a lot of problems for you and your family, William continued, and I want to do everything I can to make it right. He told her about the new charity and offered her a job to run a program to help families in need. You know better than anyone what these families need, he said. And you can ensure that the help comes in the right way and in a transparent way. Elizabeth was silent for a long time, thinking about his words. Mr. Blackwood, she finally said, I appreciate your candor, and I realize that your intentions were good, but you must realize how much pain you have caused by your actions. William nodded. I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. Elizabeth sighed. I need time to think about it, and to talk to the children. Of course, William said, standing up. I understand. Just know that my offer stands. When he was at the door, Elizabeth suddenly said, Mr. Blackwood, "Thank you for coming in person." William smiled. It was the least I could do. On the way home, William felt strangely relieved. He knew that he still had a lot of work to do, that not everyone would forgive him so easily, that rebuilding trust was a long and difficult process. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was moving in the right direction, that maybe something good could come out of all this chaos. He looked at the photo of his mother, who had always been with him. "I hope you're proud of me, Mom," he whispered. "I'm trying to do what you taught me." Although the road ahead was uncertain and difficult, William Blackwood was ready to face it with an open heart and a clear conscience. 5 years have passed since William Blackwood decided to reveal the truth about his secret charity. During this time, a lot has changed, not only in his life, but in the lives of many other people. William woke up early as usual, but now, instead of immediately checking the stock market reports, he first went out to the terrace of his apartment to enjoy the sunrise over New York City. It had become his new tradition to start the day with a moment of peace and gratitude. Today was a special day, the 5th anniversary of the founding of the Blackwood Foundation, a charitable organization that grew out of his former clandestine activities. Over the years, the foundation has helped thousands of families across the city by providing financial support, educational grants, and medical care. William smiled as he recalled how it all began. The first months were extremely difficult. Blackwood Industries suffered significant financial losses and many investors turned away from the company. But gradually, thanks to the transparency of the new charitable initiative and William's sincerity, trust began to be restored. He went down to the kitchen where breakfast was waiting for him, prepared by the housekeeper. But instead of eating alone, as he had done before, William took the tray and went to the living room where his new family was waiting for him. Thus, over the past 5 years, William's life has not only gained a new purpose, but also new close people. 2 years ago, he married Mary, a volunteer whom he met at one of the foundation's charity events. And a year ago, they adopted little Jake, a boy whose story reminded William of his own childhood. "Good morning, my dears," William said as he entered the room. Mary smiled at him, holding a sleepy Jake in her arms. "Good morning, dear. Are you ready for the big day?" William nodded, sitting down next to them. "Yes, but first, breakfast with my favorite family." They ate breakfast together, discussing plans for the day. William talked about the upcoming ceremony in honor of the foundation's anniversary, and Mary shared news about the new assistance program she was developing. After breakfast, William went to the Blackwood Industries office. The company had gone through some tough times but emerged from the crisis stronger and more ethical. The new policy of transparency and social responsibility not only restored investor confidence but also attracted new clients and partners. At the office, he was greeted by Elizabeth Thompson, who was now in charge of the Family Assistance Program at the Blackwood Foundation. Their relationship went from distrust and anger to mutual respect and cooperation. "Good morning, William," she greeted. "We have great news. Our education grant program has helped 50 more children go to college this year." William smiled broadly. "That's wonderful, Elizabeth. You're doing an incredible job." They spent the morning discussing new initiatives and plans for the future. William felt deeply satisfied that he could now openly help people without hiding or lying. After lunch, William went to a ceremony in honor of the foundation's anniversary. The event was held in a large park in the city center. Hundreds of people gathered there, those whom the foundation has helped over the years, volunteers, partners, and just concerned citizens. When William went up on stage to deliver his speech, he paused for a moment, looking around the crowd. He saw smiling faces. He saw hope in people's eyes. And at that moment he realized that all the difficulties he had gone through were worth it. 5 years ago, he began his speech, I stood before you as a man who had made many mistakes. I tried to help people in secret, thinking that this was the best way. But I realized that true kindness does not require secrecy. It requires openness, honesty, and cooperation. He spoke about the Foundation's achievements over the years, about the thousands of lives that have changed for the better. But most importantly, he spoke about the future. We are only at the beginning of our journey, he said. There is still a lot of work ahead, many lives we can help, and I am grateful to each and every one of you for being part of this mission. After the ceremony, William spoke with people for a long time, listening to their stories, their thanks, and their ideas. He felt that he had finally found his true calling. In the evening, when he returned home, William sat down in his office. He took out an old photograph of his mother and looked at it for a long time. "You were right, Mom," he whispered. "True happiness comes when we help others." Suddenly, he heard a soft knock on the door. It was little Jake in his pajamas. "Daddy," he said in a sleepy voice, "will you tell me a story before bed?" William smiled and took his son in his arms. "Of course, son. I will tell you a story about a boy who grew up and realized that the greatest wealth is the ability to help others." When William put Jake to bed, he felt incredibly happy. His life had changed so much over the years, but the changes were for the better. He had found his true purpose, created the family he had always wanted, and continued to make the world a better place. Later, sitting on the terrace with Maria and looking out over the city at night, William felt deeply grateful for everything he had. "What are you thinking about?" Mary asked, taking his hand. William smiled. "I'm thinking about how strange everything has turned out. I thought I had lost everything when the truth came out. But in fact, I found everything I could have ever dreamed of." Mary kissed him gently. "You deserve this happiness, William. You have changed so many lives for the better." "We have," he corrected. "Together with you, with Elizabeth, with everyone who believed in our mission." They sat for a long time, talking about plans for the future, about the Foundation's new projects, about how to raise Jake in a spirit of kindness and generosity. And when William finally went to bed, he felt a deep sense of peace and satisfaction. He knew there was still much work to be done, many lives to be helped. But now he had a family, a team of like-minded people, and a clear purpose. He fell asleep with a smile on his face, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to make the world a better place. And that was the greatest happiness he could have ever dreamed of.